Who was richer, George Washington or Donald Trump? And who, out of all 46 presidents, ended up completely broke after leaving the White House? You might think the answer's obvious, but trust me, it's not. Some presidents started dirt poor and built empires. Others were born into old money and still lost it all. And a few, well, let's just say their bank accounts were as complicated as their politics. From founding fathers with thousands of acres of land, to modern leaders signing multi-million-dollar book deals, the journey of presidential wealth is full of surprises. It's a story of power, privilege, risk, and sometimes pure bad luck. So stay till the end, because the richest president in U.S. history isn't who you think, and the poorest one? His story might actually inspire you. Before we start ranking every president by their wealth, let's clear something up. How do you even measure money across 250 years of history? Because, let's be honest, $1 in 1800 could buy you a horse. $1 today can barely buy you a coffee lid. So, to keep things fair, we'll talk about everyone's peak net worth, that's the most money they ever had, and adjust it all to 2020 US dollars. That means we're comparing their fortunes on the same scale. George Washington's farmland, Barack Obama's Netflix deal, Donald Trump's towers, all converted to modern money. No tricks, no hype. Just facts, and maybe a few surprises. Now, where did this money come from? It's not all politics, that's for sure. Some presidents inherited massive estates. Others married rich families. A few struck gold, literally. Some cashed in after leaving office, writing bestsellers or giving speeches for 6 figures a night. And yes, a couple of them were so broke, Congress had to bail them out. But here's the catch. Wealth doesn't always mean luxury. Many early presidents were land-rich but cash-poor. They owned thousands of acres but couldn't easily spend their fortune. Others saw their wealth vanish after bad investments, wars, or economic crashes. And a few, like Grant and Truman, learned that fame doesn't always pay the bills. So, when you hear me say Washington was worth $500 million, don't imagine him sitting on stacks of gold coins. Think land, crops. And people working that land, a kind of wealth that looked very different back then. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly how fortunes rose, fell, and sometimes came back from nothing. Ready? Let's start from the bottom, with the presidents who had almost nothing. Let's start at the bottom, the presidents who led the country, but couldn't lead their wallets. These men held the most powerful office in the world, yet still ended up counting pennies when the spotlight faded. Take Ulysses S. Grant, for example. The war hero who saved the Union, loved by millions, but terrible with money. After leaving office, he trusted the wrong business partner, lost everything in a scam, and was left broke and dying of throat cancer. To support his family, Grant wrote his memoirs, finishing the last pages just days before his death. That book became a bestseller, earning his widow enough to live comfortably. A tragic ending, but a heroic comeback. Then there's Harry Truman. When he left the White House in 1953, he didn't have much more than his old car and his army pension, about $112 a month. No speaking tours, no book deals, no lifetime security team. The man who helped rebuild Europe after World War II had to take out a personal loan to pay his bills. Congress felt so bad they created the presidential pension system. Thanks to Truman, every future president gets one. Abraham Lincoln wasn't poor by spirit. But money? That was another story. Born in a log cabin, self-taught, and constantly hustling to make ends meet. He worked as a store clerk, surveyor, and lawyer before ever dreaming of the presidency. Even at the height of his power, Lincoln lived simply, focused more on saving the Union than saving cash. These men prove that wealth isn't what makes a great president. Some left office with debts, others with bestsellers. But all left behind something far more valuable, a legacy that money could never buy. Now, not every president struggled. Some actually did pretty well, not rich, not broke, just comfortably in the middle. Not every president left the White House with empty pockets. Some walked away with just enough to live a comfortable middle-class life. No private jets. But no ramen dinners either. These were the men who managed to turn the presidency into a platform, not a paycheck. Take Barack Obama, for example. Before politics, he was a community organizer and law professor. Not exactly the fast track to fortune. But after leaving office, his books, Dreams from My Father and A Promised Land, sold millions of copies worldwide. Then came the Netflix deal. Suddenly, the Obamas went from a modest income to an estimated 70 to 100 million net worth. Proof that words, and good timing, can pay. Joe Biden followed a similar path. For decades he was known as middle-class Joe. His net worth barely scraped $1 million even after years in the Senate. But when he left the vice presidency, things changed. Book deals, paid speeches, and media appearances turned him into a millionaire in just a few years. A classic late bloomer story, slow and steady, finally paid off. Now let's rewind to the early days. Presidents like John Adams and James Madison weren't rich in the modern sense. But they lived comfortably. Adams earned a solid living as a lawyer and landowner. Madison had Virginia farmland and political clout. They weren't rolling in cash. But they weren't struggling either, the historical equivalent of today's upper middle class. These were presidents who didn't chase fortune. They worked, served, and earned respect without turning the Oval Office into a money machine. They remind us that stability, not luxury, can be its own kind of success. But not everyone had to work their way up. Some were born rich. In fact, a few presidents started life with fortunes most people can't even imagine. Now we're stepping into a very different world, the land of old money. These presidents didn't need to chase wealth. They were born into it. Mansions, estates, private tutors, the kind of luxury most people only see in movies. Let's start with John F. Kennedy. He didn't just grow up rich, he grew up legendary. His father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was a Wall Street powerhouse and one of the wealthiest men in America. The family owned real estate, film studios, and even had ties to early Hollywood. By the time JFK took office, he was already worth an estimated $1 billion in today's dollars. Politics wasn't a ladder for him, it was a stage. Then there's Franklin D. Roosevelt, another president from privilege. Born into an elite New York family, FDR's wealth came from land, railroads, and old family businesses. He spent his summers at private estates in upstate New York and studied at Harvard and Columbia. Yet, despite all that luxury, he became one of the most compassionate leaders in U.S. history, proof that empathy doesn't depend on poverty. And we can't forget the Bush family. George H. W. Bush made his fortune in Texas oil before entering politics. And his son George W. Bush followed suit. By the time they reached the White House, both already had investments, properties, and trust funds. The presidency didn't make them rich. It simply added another line to their already impressive resumes. These men were born with advantages most presidents could only dream of. But privilege alone doesn't guarantee power, it just opens the first door. What they did after walking through it defined their legacies. But not all wealth came from inheritance. Some presidents didn't get their money, they grew it, often through land, hard work, and sometimes uncomfortable history. Now we move into the most complicated chapter of presidential wealth, the men whose fortunes were built not on innovation or business, but on land, and the people who worked it. In early America, land was everything. Owning it meant power, status, and wealth. And the biggest landowners were often the most powerful men in the country, including several presidents. But this kind of wealth came with a dark reality, it was tied to slavery. George Washington, the nation's first president, was also one of its richest. His Mount Vernon estate spanned over 8,000 acres, producing tobacco, wheat, and corn. That land, and the hundreds of enslaved people forced to work it, made him worth around $600 million in today's money. Washington freed his enslaved workers in his will. But his wealth was built within that cruel system. Thomas Jefferson was no different. He inherited massive lands from his father, along with debt, and over 600 enslaved people over his lifetime. His beautiful Monticello estate symbolized freedom in his writing but not in practice. Ironically, he died in debt despite being one of the richest men of his time. Land rich, cash poor, and trapped by the very system that made him powerful. James Madison and James Monroe, both Virginians, followed similar paths. Their wealth came from sprawling plantations. But as agriculture declined, their fortunes crumbled. By the end of their lives, both faced serious financial troubles. This era of landed wealth reminds us that money often has a story, and not always a noble one. The Founding Fathers built a nation on ideals of liberty and equality. But their personal fortunes were often sustained by inequality and exploitation. As America grew, so did its opportunities. The next wave of presidents didn't inherit wealth, they earned it, building businesses, investing smartly, and turning ambition into fortune. Not every president was born with silver spoons or sprawling estates. Some hustled their way to the top: entrepreneurs, businessmen, risk-takers who made, and sometimes lost, fortunes long before stepping into the Oval Office. These are the self-made presidents, the ones who saw opportunity where others saw risk. Let's start with Herbert Hoover. Before becoming president, he wasn't a politician at all, he was a mining engineer. Hoover traveled the world, investing in mines from Australia to China. And by the time he turned 40, he was a millionaire. When he entered politics, he didn't need the job, he genuinely wanted to serve. That independence made him one of the first business presidents, long before it became trendy. Then there's Jimmy Carter, the humble peanut farmer from Georgia. Carter didn't come from money, he built his wealth through his family's small farm, expanding it into a successful agricultural business. He lived modestly even after the presidency, donating much of what he earned from books and speaking engagements. In fact, Carter famously refused to profit off his time in office. When it comes to humility, he might be the richest poor man America ever had. And of course there's Donald Trump. Love him or hate him, his fortune can't be ignored. Long before politics, Trump was a real estate developer and media figure, turning his family's business into a global brand. From skyscrapers to golf resorts and reality TV, his name became a business in itself. His net worth is debated, billions, or just shy of it, but no one can deny he redefined what it means to be a wealthy president. These presidents represent the American dream in motion, proof that, in the right era, ambition could buy you power. From gold mines to peanut farms to Fifth Avenue towers, their wealth came from hustle, not heritage. But in the modern era, fame itself became the new currency. Some presidents turned popularity into profit, through Hollywood, books, and global brands. As America moved into the modern age, money started flowing from new places: cameras, crowds, and best-selling books. Suddenly, being a president didn't just mean power, it meant brand power. Some presidents used their fame to build entire empires once they left the White House. Let's start with Ronald Reagan, the Hollywood actor who turned charisma into a career, and that career into a presidency. Before politics, Reagan starred in over 50 films, hosted TV shows, and even became the face of General Electric. When he entered the White House, he wasn't rich by modern standards, but his fame was priceless. After leaving office, he was paid over $2 million for a single speaking tour in Japan, a record at the time. The actor-turned-president ended up proving that in modern America, fame could pay better than film roles. Next up, Bill Clinton, the man who redefined post-presidential success. After leaving office, he didn't fade away, he cashed in. Between speeches, consulting, and his autobiography My Life, Clinton earned more than $100 million over 2 decades. His foundation and speaking tours turned him into one of the wealthiest living former presidents. Love him or not, he made influence his most valuable currency. And then we circle back to Barack Obama, who took the concept of presidential branding to another level. After 2 best-selling books, he and Michelle Obama signed a massive Netflix production deal, producing documentaries and films under their own company. It wasn't just business, it was legacy building through media. In this new era, fame and influence replaced factories and farmland. A camera, a microphone, and a loyal audience became more valuable than acres of land. These presidents didn't just lead nations, they learned how to lead narratives. But even with all this wealth, fame, and success, only a few presidents reached the top of the financial pyramid. The richest of them all weren't just powerful, they were massively wealthy. Now we've climbed to the top, the ultimate level of presidential wealth. These are the men who didn't just serve in the Oval Office, they could have bought it if they wanted to. Their fortunes were so massive that even centuries later, they still dominate the money leaderboard. At number 3, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the visionary behind Monticello, and a man who lived in both grandeur and debt. At his wealthiest, Jefferson was worth around $250 million in today's dollars. His estate stretched for miles, filled with art, wine, and ideas. Yet despite his brilliance, his finances were a mess. He borrowed heavily. And when he died, his family had to sell nearly everything to pay off what he owed. Wealthy, yes, but never financially free. Next, John F. Kennedy, the golden boy of American politics. The Kennedy family fortune came from real estate, stocks, and business ventures, all managed by his father, Joseph Kennedy. By the time JFK became president, his personal share of the family's wealth was worth about $1 billion in modern money. His charm, education, and background made him America's poster child for privilege, proof that some people really do start life halfway up the ladder. And finally, at number 1, Donald J. Trump. Real estate mogul, television personality, and 45th President of the United States. His net worth has been debated endlessly, but most estimates place it between $2 and $3 billion. From Manhattan skyscrapers to golf courses around the world, Trump's wealth isn't inherited, it's multiplied. Whatever you think of him, his fortune cements him as the richest president in U.S. history. From Jefferson's plantations to Trump Tower, presidential wealth tells a story of how America itself has changed, from land and labor to brands and billionaires. But here's the twist: the size of a fortune doesn't measure the size of a legacy. So, after all those billions, bankruptcies, after book deals, what does it actually mean to be a rich president? Because here's the thing: money built their lives, but not their legacies. George Washington had land and power, but his real wealth came from unity, guiding a brand new nation. Abraham Lincoln died with barely anything, yet he left behind the most valuable thing any president could: freedom. Harry Truman struggled to pay his bills, but his honesty and humility shaped how Americans saw leadership forever. From Jefferson's debt to Trump's towers, each story shows how wealth is never just about numbers. It's about choices, what you do with what you have. Some used their fortunes to expand opportunity. Others used their fame to build influence. And a few discovered that the hardest thing to manage isn't money, it's history's judgment. Across 250 years, America went from farmland to global finance, from handwritten letters to billion-dollar brands. The presidents didn't just reflect that change, they lived it. Their fortunes rose and fell with the country itself. So the next time someone asks, who was the richest president? You'll know the answer isn't simple. Because wealth fades. Power ends. But legacy? That's the one thing no amount of money can buy. And if you made it this far, congratulations. You just outlasted 2 centuries of presidential spending habits. But before you go, here's your reward. In our next video, we'll rank every U.S. president by IQ, from genius-level thinkers to those who barely passed history class. Hit that subscribe button, because you won't believe who tops that list.